sunlight. Taste of sunlight. Hi guys, so I am on my way to buy pull-ups. The busy person that I am, so I am taking the time as I'm driving to have a little chat with you about another poem. So you're constantly, some of you saying to me, oh, if you could video it, I can stop, I can go back, I can listen again. So I thought it would be an idea to think about exposure. Considering the last video that I made reference to exposure and talked about it briefly in terms of the structure, in terms of it being cyclical in nature. It's probably one of the, I wouldn't say harder poems. The majority of my students last year, when Bayonet Charge came up in the exam, chose to compare that to exposure, and it was a choice they were more than happy making. Now it's a versatile poem in the sense that you can compare it to a range of poems in the anthology. And the reason for that is because it touches on a range of themes, and it probably makes sense in your revision to think about it that way. It is a long poem. It is quite detailed. It has quite a range of images within it. But realistically, in an exam scenario, you're not going to talk about very much of that poem at all. You are only going to select the bits that are of relevance to the question. So what I thought would make sense is for us to talk through the poem briefly and have a look at the kinds of questions that may come up, and which parts of the poem are best suited to talking about those questions. So first things first, a little brief recap of the poem. Clearly it's a World War I poem. You've got Wilfred Owen, unlike the majority of the other poets in the anthology, he was on the front lines. He wrote this from the front lines. He sent his poetry home to his mum. And of course, the probably most poignant aspect of the whole thing is that days before peace was declared, he died there, away from home, in his 20s. So it's really quite sad. And if you want to do, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for all of the poems. You've got quite a lot that you need to get your head around. But for Wilfred Owen, it really won't do any harm to do a little bit of wider reading. Because if you have a look at Dulce, Decorum Est, which is a poem of his, if you have a look at Anthem for Doomed Youth, those poems will give you more of a clear view as to what Owen's political stance was. And his almost response to the propaganda. All of the poems and the posters and the patriotism that was thrown around at that time was intended so that young boys, young men would be falling over themselves, desperate to come of age, so that they could go off and be glorious and fight for their country and make everybody proud. And what Owen is showing us is actually, once you're here, it's not really like that. Once you're here, nothing's happening. Quite often you feel that you're prepared, yeah, I want to do my duty, go out, fight the enemy. But once you get there, he's pointing out the idea that sometimes the harsh conditions are going to be your enemy. And sometimes you're not going to be fighting. And the real battle is A, with the elements, the harshness of the elements, the power of nature. But B, sometimes with your own mind. And that's essentially what this is about. So I'll go back to the tip that I gave in the last video when looking at any poem, that it's a good idea to look at the beginning and look at the end. So I'm not going to repeat what I've already said in terms of it being cyclical in nature. It opens with our brain's ache. It opens with an image of discomfort. And at the end of the poem, ultimately, all eyes are ice. On us, the doors are closed. Nothing has happened, nothing has changed. If anything, the psychological state of the men has gone down even further. So that's a brief overview, really. Now, in terms of the power of nature, let's look at that first of all. If you get given that as an exam question, I feel like I'm babbling. If you get that as an exam question, the obvious one is looking at the wind and the snow and the ice. Okay, so we go in, our brains ache in the merciless ice to east winds that knife us. No one's expecting you to remember everything word for word, but for me, two key words there: merciless. He's personifying the wind And if it were a person, it would be merciless. It has no mercy. It shows no mercy in its harshness. And it's not just cold. It's kniving. It's causing this physical pain. The coldness penetrates you. And that's really the opening scene, the opening mood of the poem. Of course, looking at the power of nature. How is the power of nature presented in Exposure and another poem? So he personifies the wind immediately and gives us that sense of agony. He gives us an image of agony. He talks about, he gives a simile like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. He's describing the barbed wire that way. But the whole reference to men twitching in agony, it all works together to set this scene of immense discomfort because of the cold and because of the wind. Now, as the poem progresses, and of course this is all from my memory, and it's a good thing, because ultimately in the exam I would expect your mind to be doing similar things. So as the poem progresses, he makes reference to bullets streaking the silence. You know, the silence is used there as kind of a tension builder. It's this idea that nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens. It's repeated systematically throughout. You go there, you know, looking for a fight. You go there to fight for your country, to be patriotic, to do your parents proud. Nothing's happening. So the bullets streak the silence, and we are told that they are, quote, less deadly than the air that shudders. Black with snow. Again, you've got that juxtaposition, that oxymoron, black with snow. Snow's not black, so what's he getting there? Again, it's that dark imagery, the darkness, the blackness, the idea that this place is lifeless, it's hopeless, and that's how they feel. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. But we're sticking to the question. If the question is the power of nature, you've got the wind personified in that way, and again, as the poem progresses, we get this idea of pale flakes, another quotation here, with fingering stealth, come feeling for our faces. Again, he's not only personifying the snowflakes, but he's making them seem really sinister. They're out to get you. They're coming feeling for your faces, but you won't see them coming. With fingering stealth. They are stealthy. They will creep up on you. So not only is nature powerful, but nature is sinister, and it's stealthy, and it's out to get you, and it's sly, and it will outwit you. And again, I use that term because this poem, as much as anything else, it's about the psychological hold that nature and ultimately the war itself is having over these men. The physical discomfort is opening them up to psychological weakness. And by the end of the poem, you know, slowly our ghosts strike home. Again, quite an ambiguous image there of the ghosts, the spirits of the men, the souls of the men. They're home, they're glimpsing the sunk fires and the coziness and the warmth of home, which contrasts with the harsh coldness of the environment. So they don't want to be there. Physically, they're just about hanging on. And of course, the reference to ghosts could indeed be a reference to the idea that Owen and some other of his men won't make it home. And you get quite a poignant image there at the end. All eyes are ice. And again, could that be reference to the dead bodies who the burying party are picking up, that their eyes have physically frozen, their eyes are ice? Or could that be a metaphor? Why not entertain both ideas, that the eyes are ice, those who have died, those who are actually coming around picking them up, those who are watching them die and wondering if it's them next. You know, their eyes are metaphorically ice. That being in this condition, it's numbed them emotionally, mentally, spiritually. There's nothing left, and they're completely numb. So again, and that's looking at the power of nature. Another question that could come up with this is looking at the trauma of war. The trauma of war could be a question. And again, that's where you'd go in. Not so much looking at nature. You could talk about how the harsh conditions are perhaps triggering that trauma, or adding to that trauma, or leaving these men in a position where their minds aren't being occupied with enemy movement. How to outwit your enemy, because there's nothing happening. So ultimately they're left with the harshness of the weather. So the trauma of war, I think Exposure on a different level deals with the psychological trauma of being away at war. The idea that you feel hopeless and helpless. So our brains ache, but if you go, I'm trying to visualise the poem in my head. Our brains ache in the merciless icy winds that knife us. Wearied, we stay awake because the night is silent. It's this idea of not being able to sleep. If you're in the midst of the action, a bit like in Bayonet Charge, that's going to be worrying for you. But it's this whole idea that silence is worse than that, because you're constantly waiting for an attack. So the silence is worrying them. Sentries whisper, curious, nervous. It's the nervousness of being at war. Traumas of war, the reality of war, even the effects of war. Effects doesn't have to be after the event. The effects of war could indeed be while they're there. What effect is this having on them? So again, as the poem progresses, we get this sense of hope completely diminishing. Owen talks about cringing. About halfway through the poem, we cringe in holes. The image of someone cringing, it's a contrast really with the propaganda of the time and the bold hero, the valiant soldier. We cringe in holes. You know, it almost makes me feel as though you're looking at a rabbit going down a hole and they don't quite know what to do with themselves. Back on forgotten dreams. So Owen presents us with this strong idea. They feel as though their hopes, their dreams, their lives as men in their 20s, many of them, have been completely forgotten. And that could indeed be argued to be a political statement there, that actually they're out there, they're fighting someone else's war. And he asks himself, he questions, what are we doing here? And again, that's a parallel that you can make with Bayonet Charge. The idea, in what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the one? It's quite a complex quote, that one. But to be fair, if you boil it down, he's doing the same thing. He's asking, what are we doing here? In what madness am I the one here fighting this battle? It's not my war. So in Bayonet Charge and Exposure, both soldiers, both, I suppose, characters you've got in Bayonet Charge, the soldier is a persona, is a character created by the poet, whereas obviously Owen is talking in role as himself. But in both scenarios, the poet very sensitively portrays this idea of soldiers not knowing why they're there. Owen critiques the patriotism, whereas in Hugh's poem in Bayonet Charge, he talks about the patriotic tear that brimmed in his eye. But by the end of the poem, he's just desperate to get out. Quite a really simple, straight to the point quotation there, to get out. And there's a yelling alarm going off. So I'll do another video looking in more detail at that. But in terms of comparisons, Bayonet Charge is quite a nice one to compare it to, this idea that both of these soldiers just want out, realistically. And whereas in Hugh's poem, in Bayonet Charge, it's charging, it's action. Owen's poem is throughout the poem a sense of inaction, and you almost get the feeling that even if the action kicked in, these men are broken, completely broken. So again, towards the second half of the poem, he makes reference to a blackbird. Just remember that one word, a blackbird, where the blackbird fusses. Blossoms, blackbirds, life, nature. Now we know it's so cold out there, there's no nature. So ultimately, again, well, what's going on? Is it a hallucination? Is he seeing things? Because immediately after, in the next stanza, their ghosts drag homes. It's like they're losing their consciousness, and they're losing their affinity and their affiliation with their surroundings, and they're somewhere completely different. And by the end of the poem, all eyes are ice. So it's this idea throughout the poem that they've been forgotten, that they're not coping, they don't know what they're doing there, they're completely losing hope. And ultimately, the main message from Owen really is that no one cares. No one cares. Back on forgotten dreams. Is it that we are dying? Even the love of God, quite a religious man, Wilfred Owen, initially, even the love of God seems dying. And my final quotation, you should be mind mapping this, making a little note as I'm talking through, this whole image of the doors closing on them. On us, the doors are closed. Again, we could argue, being a political statement that Britain, the powers that be, will invest all the money in the world into this propaganda and the sense of patriotism. Once you get them out there, No one cares. So have a look at Dulce, Decorum Est. Even if you just play an audio, listen to it. Have a look at Anthem for Doomed Youth. Don't go off on a tangent in an exam, but you could give a nod to it. If we're talking about the traumas of war, the exposure hints at a political statement. It shows us this lack of morale and this demoralisation of the troops. Whereas Owen's other poems, like Anthem for Doomed Youth, for example, really cash in on that idea that these young men are dying and no one really cares. So I hope that's been useful. I do feel like I've been blathering on a little bit. Lots to cover with exposure. So in